So far, in thinking of the constitutive conception of language within the cognitive view, we have focused on the so-called specific side of it, meaning the question of whether if you are born speaking language A versus language B, does that change the way in which you think, the way in which you perceive the world? So again, whether if language A has a certain number of, let's say, color words versus language B having a different number of color words, or if language A has a certain, makes a certain grammatical construct available versus language B not having that grammatical construct, does that systematically affect the way in which you think, the way in which you relate and interface and process the external world, the physical world? Now, that is one way of thinking of the relationship between language and thought. Of course, a broader and therefore general approach to the same question is asking whether possessing a language in of itself, as opposed to having no language, if that confers some kind of advantage, or if that in of itself modifies the mechanisms of the human mind. Now, within this general approach to the constitutive conception of language, Vygotsky thought that the relationship between language and thought was best conceived of not quite as a static thing that, you know, they're either in a relationship or they're either the same thing or they're separated and that's it. Vygotsky took a developmental approach to the issue of language and thought. And he realized, or at least he theorized, that there was a continuous movement from language to thought and from thought to language. So in this sense, he realized that or at least again, he theorized that language and thought might start in the beginning independent in the human mind. And then over the course of development, they grow to become deeply interconnected. And that interconnection is what allows complex thought to arise. Now, as I'll discuss a little bit more in just a moment, Vygotsky was influenced by another Russian psychologist, Sokolov, who really stressed the importance of inner language. And so Vygotsky separated what he considered external language versus internal language. Now, the idea goes more or less as follows. At first, when children, at first, in infants and young children, language and thought are entirely unrelated. Now, Vygotsky does sort of concede that children are perfectly capable of having nonverbal thoughts. And however, the first use of words and babble, that is pre-intellectual in nature. Then children start using so-called external language or external speech. And the idea is that there starts being some loose correlation between the use of language or the timing with which children use words and the actual actions and meaning of what is happening. So you might imagine a young child, something happens, maybe a ball rolls and the child points at it and sort of possibly at a delay says ball. Or maybe the child is walking, falls down, and they look up and then they say fall, something of that sort. So in this sense, there is some relationship between what is being said and what is happening, but it's generally fairly loose. And it often is more a type of naming and pointing at an event using words. Now, finally, as children grow through development, what starts as external speech turns into internal speech. And the idea is that internal speech is, if you want, sort of the voice that you can hear in your own mind. What is special about this is that internal speech might be an integral component of complex thinking. And so the idea is that through internal speech, you can actually direct your thought. And from that, you can actually have more complex thought possible. So the idea according to Vygotsky, is that the two start independent and they slowly sort of grow together. And that growing together is what ultimately leads to complex thought emerging. Now, as I said a moment ago, Vygotsky was particularly influenced by another group of Russian psychologists led by Sokolov. And Sokolov really stressed, as I said a moment ago, the importance of inner speech and how inner speech is involved in many, though he recognized not all, aspects of thinking. Indeed, Sokolov used a lot of speech interference studies and also studies in which he would measure subvocal recording while people were, for example, solving some tests of nonverbal ability or something of that sort. So he would notice and he observed and measured how people would use inner speech in complex cognition. Now then, another aspect that was important for Vygotsky were observations such as that of Luria and Udovich in 1956. Now what they did is they studied twins who had not acquired language. By 5, they really just had an extremely rudimentary amount of language. And now what was interesting is that after the two children were placed in contact with other children, and so at that point they did start acquiring language, as Luria and Udovich report, the whole structure of their mental life was simultaneously and sharply changed. In fact, what they observed is that suddenly their pretend play became more symbolic, more sophisticated, more creative, and that they started demonstrating greater reasoning abilities. So in other words, once these children started acquiring language, natural language, then suddenly they could start doing things in terms of the complexity of their own thoughts that they could not do before. Now, of course, it is not very easy to interpret these kind of studies. There typically are many confounds within these kind of studies. However, they do make a point of the fact that language may well play an important role in the, not just across any form of thought, but might play a role in the generation of complex cognition.